Most of the things we use in everyday life were invented by adults, but you'd be surprised how many products have been invented by children. Genius children with incredible minds. Here are the top 15 unbelievable child inventions. Number 15. Snowmobile. If you're trying to get somewhere in the snow, there's only one type of vehicle you'll want to use to get there quickly and have fun while you're doing it: a snowmobile. They've become a vital way to keep communities connected in colder regions, but amazingly, this wasn't the idea of a seasoned inventor. The first snowmobile was created by a 15-year-old boy. Joseph Armand Bombardier was interested in mechanics, and in 1922 he proudly showed his parents his invention that he had made by mounting the engine from a Ford Model T onto 4 runners and attached a handmade propeller to the back. In trials, this enabled him to travel half a mile across the snow before it stopped, and it became somewhat of a life passion of his to perfect the design. In 1959, Bombardier, then 52 years old, released the Ski-Doo, which was the world's first superlight model of a snowmobile. Number 14. Braille. In a world where communication and information is presented in ways that are so reliant on the ability to see and hear, it can be frustratingly difficult for those with impairments to interact the way they should be able to. Louis Braille learned this the hard way when, at the age of 3, he contracted an eye infection that would leave him without sight for the rest of his life. For the next 9 years, he struggled to read by tracing his finger around the outline of raised letters on specialized paper, and soon realized that individual letters were quite difficult to differentiate through this method, and it was often virtually impossible to identify specific words. By the time he had turned 12, he was given the opportunity to learn a method of silent communication that had been developed by the French military. But still, this proved to be far more complicated than he thought it should be. He was left with only one option. He created his own way of writing, which consisted of raised bumps on paper that the tips of the fingers could easily identify. This method became known as Braille and is still used worldwide to this day. Having made life so much easier for people with limited sight, it's incredible to think it was invented by a child. Number 13. Trampoline. There's no doubt that trampolines are some of the most fun pieces of equipment you can play on as a child. And for those who keep practicing through adulthood, they can be used to perform incredible performances where people launch themselves to insane heights. And you might expect that something so fun, potentially dangerous, and relatively simple in design has been around for hundreds of years. But surprisingly, the first was only built in 1930. It was invented by George Nissen, who was 16 at the time, and began with a strong metal frame that he stretched a canvas over. He was inspired to make it after seeing a trapeze artist performance, and thinking how much better it would have been if their safety nets could provide bounce, so they could then keep jumping from spot to spot. He soon got to work in his parents' garage, and after his first attempt, he continued perfecting his ideal trampoline for many years to come. Number 12. Calculator. Nowadays, if you need to make a quick calculation, you only need to reach for your smartphone to gain access to a powerful computer. Things used to be far more complicated than that. It might surprise you to know, though, that the first mechanical calculators were actually introduced in the mid-17th century. And even more incredible was the fact that they were designed by a child prodigy, Blaise Pascal. He had been educated by his father, who was a local tax collector, and turned his interest to physics at a very young age. His study required the use of advanced mathematics, and he found it tedious to calculate everything on paper. So set his mind on finding a quicker solution. He spent 3 years of his latter teen years trying to perfect his idea. After building 50 prototypes, he finally made something that worked, which is now known as a Pascal calculator. This invention was at the forefront of automation, and as well as being the first mechanical calculator, is arguably one of the earliest types of computer to ever be built. So much of the tech we rely on in modern life can be traced back to this, making Pascal one of the most influential inventors to have ever lived. Number 11. Christmas lights. Every year when Christmas comes around, the world is lit up in a blaze of light when people decorate their trees, houses, and buildings with countless colorful bulbs. This wasn't always the way things were done, though, and only started happening in the 20th century. Before then, people would decorate their trees with candles, and even though they involved having open flames on dry trees, they were seen as being far safer than the mysterious electrical methods of creating light that were being introduced at the turn of the century. Eventually, though, people began to start trusting electric lights, but they were still extremely expensive. In 1917, however, supposedly after a fire in New York that had been caused by candles on a Christmas tree, 15-year-old Albert Sadaka saw an opportunity and developed some novelty lights from his parents' company for use on trees. Soon, there was more demand than he could cope with, and by 1925, he and several other companies combined to form the Noma Electric Company. and dominate the market for decades to come. Number 10. The iPack. In 2013, 11-year-old Kylie Simons was set an assignment in class to create something to solve an everyday problem, and within a year she was handling her first patent application and meeting with companies who wanted to put her idea into production, all while still continuing with her studies. She had gone through a tough childhood, having been diagnosed with cancer at the age of 8 and spending most of her time in hospital and pulling around a big IV pack with her wherever she went. When presented with the opportunity to create something, it was a no-brainer to her. She wanted to make a backpack that could contain the IV and everything else cancer sufferers would need, making what's normally a cumbersome amount of equipment portable. The final product had the potential to drastically alter lives of thousands of young people with cancer around the world. Her first fundraiser gained $47,000 in just 2 months, and she's now branched out with further designs that are all based around the original idea of a lightweight protective metal cage that can hold the delicate equipment and keep it protected at all times. Number 9. Walking battery. We've all been there. It's been a long day out and you need to make a call, but your phone's battery is somehow completely drained. There aren't always power points nearby, and not everyone's prepared enough to have a backup battery with them wherever they go. But in 2014, a 15-year-old child genius revealed his solution to this problem to the world. Angelo Casimiro from the Philippines had designed a device that's worn around the ankle and can generate an electrical charge. He had realized that the average person takes 7,000 steps per day, and it seemed like a use of energy that could be harnessed for the technology that we take around with us. While it doesn't produce enough to keep a device like a phone charged constantly, it gives enough extra juice to be able to power it up to make that important call or message. In tests, he was able to generate enough to use a phone for 10 minutes after playing basketball for 2 hours. But it's not just phones that will benefit from this. His main aim was to provide lighting to poor rural communities with no mains access. The device was showcased at the Google Science Fair in 2014, and since then he's gone on to develop a series of further devices, making him one of the most prolific child inventors of the time. We are constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button. Number 8. Baby Hot Seat. Despite every parent's best intentions, it's a fact of life that sometimes things can be forgotten, and technology can be instrumental in making everyone's lives easier. Having begun inventing at the age of 11, Alyssa Chavez had heard tragic stories of children dying after being left in hot cars and decided to do something about it. By her mid-teens, she had developed a new product called the Baby Hot Seat, with the intent to make tragedies like these a thing of the past. The idea behind it is simple, but deployed in an incredibly easy-to-use way. She began exploring different alarm technologies that were available and adapted them for this purpose. The pressure-sensitive device is placed in the child seat in a car and is connected to the smartphone of the adult responsible for them. If the child is left in the car when it's locked, the alarm will trigger to remind the adult that they've left their infant behind. She was granted the patent on her design at the age of 17, which made her the youngest Latina patent holder in the US, and has given her the opportunity to continue developing this product and to explore other ideas in the range. Number 7. Hands-on basketball. When you watch the NBA, you could be forgiven for thinking that basketball is a relatively easy sport to play. But when you hold a ball, you realize just how skilled and practiced the stars on the court actually are. In 1994, Chris Haas, who was 9 at the time, was watching his friends play basketball, and he couldn't believe how many of them were missing what looked like to be easy shots. He realized that the main mistake they were making was to do with their hand position on the ball, and that with some adjustment they'd soon be nailing the shots every time. It was from this realization that the hands-on basketball was born, a ball with handprints marked on it to teach people the correct position to hold it, to give them the best chance of improving their game. He entered it into a design competition at his local school, and even though he didn't win, his teachers saw so much promise in the idea that they encouraged him to stick with it. His parents helped him to patent it, and there was such an interest that it was soon licensed to a sports equipment manufacturer, and hundreds of thousands of balls were sold worldwide. Number 6. Electric television. Virtually every home in the US has a television, and many have more than just one. When you look at them, you can see how much technological know-how has gone into their design, likely the result of rooms of engineers and designers deciding on how best to build them. But amazingly, the first ever electronic TV was created by a child. Philo Farnsworth has been fascinated with electronics ever since he first had a long-distance phone call with a relative. And despite living in a home without electricity until the age of 14, he was at high school when he began developing a means of transmitting images via radio waves in the same way as audio could be. While several other inventors around the world had invented crude means of image generation on a screen and demonstrated a television based on rotating discs, Farnsworth's invention, which he showed to the world in 1927, was the first recognizable ancestor to the sets that we use today. It used scanning electrons to project an image onto a screen, and the first image he transmitted onto it was a line. According to the stories from the time, an investor had asked him when they'd see dollars on the thing, at which point he turned to the camera of the image of a dollar sign. But it wouldn't be too long until they all benefited from the invention. Just 12 years later, RCA paid to use his patents, and were the first company to sell TV sets across the US. Number 5. Earmuffs. We as humans are remarkably capable of surviving extreme conditions that the world can throw at us, but that doesn't necessarily mean things are comfortable all of the time. One of the most miserable things we can experience is when we get too cold. And due to the restriction of blood flow around our bodies, our extremities, such as our fingers and toes, begin to unbearably hurt. In 1873, 15-year-old Chester Greenwood was ice skating with his friends and noticed this effect happening in his ears. He tried wrapping a scarf around his head to keep them warm, but this didn't work anywhere near as well as he had hoped, so he decided to invent something to solve the problem. He made a wire frame and got his grandmother to sew beaver skins to it, and with that, earmuffs were born. By the time he was 19, he had been granted a patent on his invention and went on to sell them around the world, including to soldiers during the First World War, who credited the devices with helping them concentrate in the cold North European environments. Number 4. Eye aid. Most inventions that solve a problem are created by people who directly experience that problem for themselves. But there's something about a child's incredible capability for compassion towards others that led to the eye aid being developed. When Alex Deans was 12 years old, he saw a visually impaired woman struggling to cross a busy street on her own. He became sure that he would be able to design something to help, even though he didn't immediately know what, and spent his free time over the next 3 years working on the problem. His solution was a product that tries to imitate a bat's ability of echolocation and uses ultrasonic sensors to scan the surroundings. With 4 sensors attached to a belt, a signal is sent to a joystick that is used to inform the user of the location of obstacles. In 2015, he won a design prize because of this invention, but he's not done yet. He plans to keep refining it and is determined to use everything that he's learned to create something that has far more uses than the current version does. Number 3. Popsicle. One of the best things when the weather's hot is having a popsicle. Not only do they help cool down, but they're also great for keeping kids quiet for a few minutes, or reminding adults of their childhoods. So it seems quite fitting that the first ones were made by a child, and furthermore, it was a complete accident. In 1905, when he was 11 years old, Frank Epperson had made himself a drink containing soda water powder and water. He wanted to cool it down, so left it in the snow outside with the stirring stick still in it, but for some reason forgot to go back to get it. So it was left there overnight. In the morning, when he left his house, he found the frozen drink around the stick, and the first popsicle had been made. It would be another 17 years until the idea really took off when he gave them out at a fireman's ball. And it was then that he trademarked them as the Epsicle. His own children didn't think much of the name, though, and called it a popsicle, something that stuck. It means that not only did a child invent the treat, but his children came up with the name too. Number 2. Superman. In 1930, 2 geeky 16-year-old students, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, met each other for the first time and knew that they were destined for great things together. Little did they know at this time that they were about to invent one of the most influential characters in literary history that would spearhead an entire genre of fiction for decades to come. They had created a number of characters that were featured in New Fun and Detective Comics, but they struggled to find a place for their favorite creation, an alien that wore blue and red clothes, had super strength, and could fly. They had been developing their Superman for several years before he finally made his first appearance in Action Comics #1, and the rest was history. There's a dark side to this story, however, because the two were only paid $130 for the rights to the character that would go on to generate billions. Following a dispute with the publisher, they weren't even credited as having created him. And it was only after a public campaign during the release of the first Hollywood movie that their place in comic book history was rightfully acknowledged. Number 1. Swimming flippers. While we're definitely designed for moving across land, humans aren't too bad at swimming through water, too. We definitely aren't as fast as animals that are adapted for that environment, though. And it was from looking at fish and other marine life that a young Benjamin Franklin came upon the idea of swimming flippers. He realized that he could travel through the water faster if he had a larger surface area to push with, and his first design was a handheld fin made from oval wooden planks that had holes in the middle for his hands. The designs have, of course, come on leaps and bounds since these first prototypes, but it shows how one of history's most successful inventors was already analyzing the world around him and creating life-enhancing designs at an impressively young age.